Um,
I'll just start now.
yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
All right. So, hi everybody. My name's Mark Blyth. Finn contacted me out of the blue and said, "I've been listening to your nonsense, and you seem to actually have a slightly different take on all this shit from everybody else. So why don't you come on my YouTube channel and tell everybody the way the world works?" Now, of course, if I actually really knew the way the world works, I wouldn't be on a YouTube channel. So put a discount on this. But it is my considered musings. So there you go. That's pretty much all the intro I've got. Where do you want to go?
So where do you work and like what do you do for a living?
Oh, I did it for a living. Oh, yeah, there's always that, isn't there? So I'm an academic. I'm a pointy-headed academic. I'm a political economist, which means that my PhD is in political science, but I actually study economics as a thing in the world rather than a way of studying the world. What does it do? Why are economic ideas important? Why do we believe some economic ideas rather than others? And that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing for quite some time. I teach at Brown University in the United States. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not from there. I'm from Dundee in Scotland. And there you go. That's it. And clearly, I like blue. This is all.
Yeah, good match, good match.
That,
Got to be color coordinated these days, you know.
indeed. In fact,
Um,
honestly, I had a grey one on, but I just moved the whole pile of wood, and it was covered in sweat. So I knew that if I came on this, I would look like I just spilled my tea all over. So I thought I better post it. This is actually yesterday's T-shirt,
oh
so
yeah,
that's the
fair
effort I made. There we go.
well, I got the classic flannel going, trying to get it started, trying to get it as a thing. It seems to be working so
That'll
far.
never take off. Nah, the
Yeah,
T-shirt and flannel stuff never take off.
yeah, nah, they don't like the flannel. I keep trying to get it started, and no, it's not taking off.
It's not doing it.
Um, So yeah, one of the main reasons I want you on is because I read your book and it just threw me off. Like you said, you're one of the only people that is actually talking about it where it makes sense. You know, which is fucking rare. Not to swear so much, but it's very rare. So in your book, you're actually bringing forward an idea which I've never heard before, which is agronomics. So do you want to explain it, or do you want me to explain
Shall
it?
I take it away? All right.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the kind of the brute economics of this, right? So if you want a very broad sweep of what's been going on for the past 50 years, it would go. So, and this is Lucy, the golden retriever, by the way. If you who's going to interrupt constantly,
Yeah.
a broad sweep would be something like this, right? Stylized but kind of true, right? So one of the big lessons coming out of the Great Depression was that fascism sucks and Stalinism probably isn't much better. So if you want to have kind of any version at all of free market capitalism, you have to make it more compatible with democracy. One of the ways you do this is to stop making the investor class run off with all the goodies and tell everybody who's poor that it's their fault. That was the lesson of the Great Depression. So we built a whole bunch of new economies, or rather restructured these economies after World War II in a specific way. We all basically made cars. Even Australia made cars, right? They were General Motors. Everybody traded amongst each other, but there was very little financial trading going on. There was no derivatives markets, no big currency markets. Finance was closed off because the idea was you keep your investment at home. You have a very high level of investment. You tax and spend at a high level. You transfer across the income distribution. And that way you kind of keep people well off and you get rising productivity and rising wages, and one pays for the other, and that's it. And that worked really well for about 30 years. And that's when, by 1973, across the rich countries of the world, Labour's share of national income was at its all-time high, about 64% in the US. It was comparable elsewhere. Then the kind of the bug in the software, if you want to put it that way, came up, and that was inflation. If you run kind of closed hothouse economies very hard and run full employment is what your big policy goal for a very long time, what that means is by the time that you get 30 years into this gig, the dumbest person you know can resign at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday and get a better paying job at 1 o'clock on a Thursday because labour markets are super tight and everybody's organised into unions. So if you don't want to pay more, then we'll go on strike, etc., etc. Huge industrial conflict over the world at that point in time. Then what happens is basically capital comes along and says, we're not playing this game anymore. So you get the era of neoliberalism. What does that mean? Privatize, integrate, globalize, liberalize, take all the pricing power away from labor, basically create a whole new structure of the economy and get the central bank in charge to make sure that we target inflation and prices are stable so that our profits are stable so that we don't get this problem we had in the 70s. Now, this was brilliantly successful for about 30 years, but there was another bug in the software. The bug in the software is if you basically take pricing power away from labor, if you take their ability to say, oi, we've got a productivity gain, you're meant to split it with me, and rather the businessman just says, no, I'll just keep it and give it to my shareholders, what you get is a break between productivity growth and income growth. And you see this starting about 1973, and it amplifies across the world in the 80s and 90s. What that means is that all the returns are going to capital. They're going to 5% of the population, the investor class, the people who do that sort of stuff, and wage earners, wage stagnation. But what we did at the same time was a one-time kind of like boost. We liberalized the banking sector everywhere. So you don't just get global financial flows, you get credit cards, you get loans, you get all the shit you didn't have before. Now, that's all fine if your wages are rising, because over time, right, the real value of the debt's going to go down as your wages go up. But then you add 400 million people to the global labor market in the 1990s. And what you get is consistent price deflation, right? Prices are going down, not up. And then it's very, very hard for anybody to get wage increases unless you're at the very top end of the income distribution. So how do people keep going when their wages aren't growing? They take on debt. But those debts are what banks call assets. So as the banks were celebrating in 2000s, their assets getting bigger and bigger, what they were basically doing was just lending it to everybody who couldn't make ends meet with their wages. So what happens is the banks eventually crash in 2008. And rather than resetting the system as we did in the 1970s, rather we come along and basically say, would you like a bailout? That'd be great, because your assets are the incomes and pensions of the top 20% of the population who we actually give a shit about. So we're going to make sure that we use the public purse, the taxpayers' bailout, to bail out the banks to make sure that those people are okay. This will be a huge new amount of public spending, but what we'll make sure is we'll do this austerity policy, and that basically means that we'll cut spending on all the stuff that actually matters to everybody else. So to take my favourite example from the north of England, the city of Preston loses 30% of its budget for 5 years in a row, right? And is meant to make ends meet at a time when unemployment's exploding. Meanwhile, London suffers zero austerity because that's where all the money is, right? So what this does is create what's already going on, this big polarization between urban and rural, between the big metropolitan centres that have got all the cash and everywhere else in the country. And it creates a lot of anger, and it creates a whole sense of like, the game is rigged. And I'm working harder with less protections for the same amount of money. Stuff costs more. I'm constantly asked to pay for more shit. And at the same time, all the profits seem to be going to someone else. Now, is there other things going on that's adding to this? Hell yes, the way that sort of our bodies, we're all getting fat. Why are we all getting fat? One part of that is stress. It's stress hormones, simply because we're sedentary. We're working 50 hours a week, right? We're eating shit food, all of which is tied into the fact that we just basically have turned ourselves into cogs in the industrial wheel once again. So yeah, there's more going on than that, but that's a pretty good place to start. And the basic point of Agronomics is if you see that story unfolding, little surprise if people are pissed off, and they will listen to people like Trump, who say it's the fault of China. They'll listen to people like Farage, who say it's the EU. And whether it is China or the EU doesn't really matter. The fact is you're giving people, for once, a focal point for their anger at the kind of technocratic elites that have run everything, as far as they're concerned, for the past 30 years for their own self-interested ends.
So
there you go.
So it was Obama that bailed them out in 2008. I was thinking about this yesterday, it just popped in my mind. If he had taken that money and instead of giving it to the CEOs and the guys at the top of the banks and actually used it to instead kind of cancel off some of the debt from the people, would it be different? Would people still be pissed off, or would we'd be in the same situation?
So if you think about it, right, let me unpack this a little bit more, right? You have an apartment somewhere. That apartment has a mortgage. To you, the asset is the apartment, not the mortgage. To the bank, the mortgage is the asset, the income that comes in from that. And the last thing they want is what you call an asset, which is a house, because they don't do houses. So assets and liabilities are each other's kind of things. So when you bail out a bank, what you're doing is you're making sure that you can stay in the house because the debt contract that finances it is still there. So how you would actually take the equivalent amount of money and kind of bail out the people, it's a nice idea, but then you would have to do something fundamental to like restructure how banking works, how to make that work, right? So I could give you the money directly to keep paying your mortgages rather than loan the money to the bank to give them enough liquidity to keep trading so that they can then ask you for the mortgage, right? It's filling in it's the same thing coming in different directions. One of them is obviously more just in some sense, But the other one's probably more efficient in the other sense, unless you're willing to watch your banks collapse.
Well, that's what they were doing anyway, though. Like they were already collapsing, weren't they?
Oh
Because
yeah,
of
but
the
you don't really want that, right? Because at the end of the day, most of the money that we spend in the world is bank money. It's not central bank money. It's not
yeah.
the shit from reserves of the central bank, right? It's the fact that Macquarie Bank basically makes a loan to you to buy a motorbike, right? And then when you give the money back, that valorizes, that creates the actual deposit, right? That's how we all spend credit money. If the thing that supports your credit money disappears, if that basically collapses, then do you get to keep the motorbike? Does it matter because you can't use your credit card anymore? I mean, how far do you want to go down? We've built this huge Tower of Babel and money, right? What happens if we blow the whole thing up? $64,000 question, but it probably would hurt a bit. Lucy, what are you growling at? Hang on, she's seen a ball.
No, that's all right.
She's seen her ball. I hit it.
Yeah.
Now she's going to come back and really
sniffing around for it, trying to find it. Yeah.
Anyway,
mine actually ate my wallet last week.
Oh, nice one.
Not the cards, the wallet. Like tore apart the wallet. Ridiculous. No idea. Yeah, no, that's quite strange because like you'd think that people would be less pissed off because either way the system was collapsing because of the loans that the banks were giving out. They knew they were giving them out to people who couldn't pay them back, and they were doing it and then mixing them with the loans that could get paid back. So they were creating the collapse themselves. So either way, the collapse was going to happen. It's just
right. I mean, the interesting one is though. I mean, the Australian banks, even though they're super concentrated as like 4 real banks and they're all like heavily levered, they weren't exposed to the things that started to bring the house down. I mean, when the then Labour government in Australia, if memory serves me right, brought in the guarantee that says, don't worry, everything's safe, right? They didn't actually do that much in the way of bailouts. They basically just did credit guarantees, which essentially is telling the market, if these guys get into trouble, we will bail them out, but we're not actually bailing them out. Most of the bailouts happened, the United States, United Kingdom, when Northern Rock went bust. The German banks, the Landesbanks that bought shitty mortgages, that's where most of that started. But to me, the financial crisis is just one tiny part of the story, right? I don't really want to fetishize it, right? It's not like people are pissed off about the financial crisis. They're not. They're pissed off about the fact that their wages are stagnant and their costs are increasing. And all the financial crisis did was bring that into relief for a moment. And then the same bullshit continued.
Yeah. So where do they go from here? Like how to increase the wages again and bring everyone back to like a happy-ish level?
Happy-ish? Well, if you think of, so people talk about this as a regime shift, right? Which is a fancy way of saying maybe we should do something else. So if you look at what Biden's trying to do, and he'll never get it through Congress, right? But this is what he's trying to do. There's $1 trillion for infrastructure spending. Now, infrastructure spending is good because if you ever travel to the United States, our airports make third world airports look like Singapore, right? It's awful. The connectivity is awful. We have like really sclerotic markets. If you want to get a digital connection, there's always like some local monopoly that charges you 3 times what you would in Europe for like half the speed. So there's a bunch of garbage that we can clean up. So that's the easy stuff, right? Bridges, roads, whatever, right? They create jobs, whatever, that spills over, right? What he wants to do is spend 2.3 trillion on what he calls social infrastructure. So this is things like, this is the only country in the world where there's no paid leave. This is where basically you would sort of incentivize people to have more kids because our birth rate's falling like everybody else, simply because you have to spend, as a couple, all your time at work, all your time commuting, at least for the pandemic, right? And schooling, if you're not in the public schools, costs an absolute fortune, right? So he wants to basically subsidize those costs so that people can, in a sense, de-stress, and so that their dollar wages will rise and will buy more. That's the basic idea behind it. I mean, essentially what happened was when Trump went into Pennsylvania in 2015 and said, I am your voice, right? Everyone roared back because they hadn't had one forever. You have people like Hillary Clinton running around celebrating Obama and talking about 4 more years because things were so good. Meanwhile, if you were in Wisconsin, this is a place that used to be one of the per capita richest states in the United States, had a first-class research university, all the sort of like odds and ends. And 20 years of tax cuts, budgetary austerity, and wage stagnation had like, you telling me this place is fine? You're joking. So Trump walks in and in a sense gives voice to that which is already there. Now, where does that go next? Biden is a direct reaction to this. Biden is basically a change of guard within the Democratic Party, away from the Larry Summers of that period, to say, no, we're going to try something different. We've basically given all the profits to the top. We've given very little in terms of wages, and we need to redress that balance, because if we don't, what happens is January the 6th, the insurrection happens again. And that's pretty serious, right? So, that's what they're trying to do.
You said before Congress won't pass it. Why won't they pass it?
Because they're Republicans.
But I don't see how sides affects it.
Your failure is my success.
Yeah.
It's that simple, right? You can dress it up in terms of ideology or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, here's a simple way, not a simple way, here's a good way of thinking about it, right? What is it the Democrats really want to do? They want to raise wages and decarbonize the economy. Why? Because there's a climate crisis and a political crisis. Okay. How do Republicans look at this? If you look at every Republican state, the one thing that they've all got in common is they all trade, dig up, refine, process, or otherwise live off of carbon and its derivatives. You start in Alaska, go through the Dakotas, go all the way down to East Texas, hang a left, come all the way up through Louisiana, and then end up in West Virginia, coal country, right? So basically, the green transition is a mortal threat to the business models of all of those states. Now, are you going to trust the Democrats to put your best interests at heart and make sure that you guys make it through the green transition, when at the end of the day, New York doesn't really give a shit and just wants to have its electricity? So, you can even stay away from all of this, and you just end up with a story whereby Republican states are basically in a kind of, a stranded asset problem. If they keep fighting, they can milk the current business model for a little bit longer, and they'll do that. On the other hand, the other one is a great leap of faith to basically embrace the Green New Deal, which goes against everything that they stand for in terms of small government, local government, taxation, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's that. So essentially, Biden, let's do social infrastructure. You want me to spend my tax dollars so that women can not go to work? That's not going to happen.
Would the taxes increase with the spending? Obviously, they'll have to, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and they should increase. I mean, Christ, the top marginal rate of taxation in the 1950s in the United States was 90%. 90%, right? Because nobody actually paid that. That was for everybody. But the thing was, the bottom moved up. Everybody paid 30% to 40%, and the top was massively expanded, so that when you drew the curve as to who paid taxes, it was everybody, and it generated a ton. What we've done is just cut the top at the same time as all the cash has gone to the top, so that you have to squeeze the bottom in the middle ever harder to get the same amount of revenue, which we can never get enough of. So we have permanent deficits, which every year adds to that thing called the national debt, which may not be as big a problem as people think, but that's kind of where it goes. That's the budgetary politics behind it.
Why is it not as big as or as bad as people think? Like it's $28 trillion, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. People keep buying it.
Yeah,
it's remember the thing about assets and liabilities, right? This is the only way to think about this, right? Like basically, nobody puts a gun to your head and says, "Go buy treasuries." People buy treasuries because it's a good way of safeguarding the value of your money over 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 years, and you get paid very small, but you get paid a rate of interest for doing so. So unless you think the United States is going to collapse and never pay its bills in the next 10 years, which is hugely unlikely because of many factors, but because basically it's the global reserve currency and 70% of global reserves and 60% of all billing transactions internationally are done in US dollars, that when you buy a treasury bill, what you're doing is the United States Treasury is issuing a liability that you hold as an asset. Nobody's forcing you to do this. So, the United States is in debt for $28 billion. What it's done is actually create $28 trillion of assets for the private sector. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Every now and again, I would go down to the Naval War College, which is quite close to where I live, and give a talk on kind of the global economy. So I'd walk into this room and it'd be staff civilians and then some flag officers and stuff. And I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the main constraint on the United States Navy is the federal budget. If we continue on at this point with $20 trillion, then if interest rates ever go up, there'll literally be nothing left for the Navy. So I'm going to give you a choice. If you could eliminate half the US national debt just now, would you do it? And every hand goes up and go, congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, you've just destroyed the global economy because you just wiped out half of national savings. You just took the bedrock that's the credit pyramid, this foundation of credit for all the financial transactions going on in the world, and evaporated them. You just took global liquidity, right? Your ability to buy and sell stuff, and evaporated it. So if you do that, congratulations, you'll destroy the world. Now, does that mean you can keep going limitless as long as you want? Well, Japan's currently at 240, and they don't look as if to be in such a crisis, right? So I'm rather skeptical of the doom mongering about the debt. Most of the doom mongering for the debt comes from think tanks that were set up by billionaires because they don't want to pay a wealth tax. And that's what their job is, to basically, the debt, it's terrible, right? I mean, if you look at that big clock in New York that's running around that, if you just put the top of it, our national savings, would it look so bad?
Yeah. But is it because then is it because the savings themselves are actually the banks, not the people's? Would it be different if it was the people's?
No, it's not like that. It's not like that. Forget the banks, right? Basically, treasuries are a promissory note, an asset issued by the United States government that you swap for cash, which they themselves print. I mean, like, think this one through, right? So, and the only thing it's redeemable against is cash. Now, if you do this on a global scale, here's what's been going on. For every asset's a liability, every surplus must have a corresponding deficit. So the other big one is the United States has this huge deficit. Yes. Why does it have a huge deficit? Because China and Germany have huge surpluses. And if you add together all of the surpluses, it comes to within 5% of all the deficits. And the biggest deficit is the United States. If the United States stopped running its deficit, the economies of Germany and China would collapse because they'd have nowhere to put their exports. Now, when we pay for BMWs, when we pay for Chinese-made televisions, right, what happens is we send them US dollars. Those US dollars are absolutely useless to a Chinese supplier because you don't use US dollars in China. So the Bank of China takes those dollars and issues an equivalent amount of currency, and that's the local currency that they go off and make more TVs, right? So now you've got this huge pile of dollars. Those dollars are basically a liability in your banking sheet because you don't use dollars. You've taken all these dollars, you've issued all this domestic currency, and you have to match that liability with an asset. Otherwise, you're just pissing money out the door. So what's the easiest way to do that? You come along and then you buy treasury bills because those treasury bills are assets. So the Chinese, every time they do this, basically accumulate about $2 to $3 trillion of treasuries that they're desperate to not do, but they're caught in this loop. They sell us TVs, we give them cash. They don't want the cash, they want an asset. The best asset they can buy is a treasury because it's the same as cash. It's completely liquid. You can turn it into anything and it has an interest rate attached to it. So you get paid some stuff. And then they take that and what do they do with it? They gather that up as their reserves. That's their savings. So we're swapping bits of paper bearing 2% for basically TVs and BMWs. And then we think we're the one with the problem?
What?
You put the ball under there. I'm not getting it.
This may be a stupid question, but what gives the treasury bills like the interest? Where's that interest coming from?
So the interest, this gets a bit techy, but essentially when you buy that bond, like you don't need to hold it. You can sell it to someone else. You can swap it for another bond. You can swap it for all sorts of stuff, right? So that means there is what they call a secondary market. And the secondary market determines basically the price, what something's worth between now and maturity, relative to an interest rate that you get on for holding the bond. And that's the whole issue of bond. That's the whole market for bond trading, et cetera, et cetera. If you're a place like Italy, for example, Italy has an enormous debt. Now they have a problem because they're in the euro. They can't print their own cash. Their cash is rationed by the Germans. Now, what that means is if your economy is growing, like the US tends to grow at about 2 to 2.5% a year, if at the end of the day, the rate that you're promised to pay on the bonds is 1.5%, over time, even though you're issuing debt, the debt will disappear. That's what happens after World War II, right? So you end up with 160% debt to GDP, and then you're growing at 4%, but you're paying 2% on your debt. It just shrinks over time. Now, if you're Italy in the current moment, you've got a totally different problem. You haven't grown in 20 years. So even if the rate on your bond is 2%, and let's say 1% of that is inflation, so really it's 1%, that 1% is going to continue to accumulate over time. and your debt's going to get bigger and bigger, even if you're not issuing it. That's when you get into trouble.
Which is kind of what's happening now, because you said before, and I've seen this as well, that the population rates are dropping. So does that mean that may start happening in America?
No, because what's your alternative? I mean, basically, you're going to swap out 70% of all the credit notes in the global economy for what? British pounds? Give me a break. Forest bonds? You can buy Chinese stuff, but Xi might then just default on you because he can, right?
Yeah.
So, what's your other options? Is it crypto? We could go with crypto, apart from the fact that basically nobody really understands how it works. Most of the wallets, or most of the crypto is held in about half a dozen wallets by big whales, and most of it's kind of extremely volatile. So if it's worth like 100 at one day and 3 days later it's worth 50, how are you going to use this to pay for shit?
Well, that'd be the same argument for the Xi's money. So
for the what?
Xi's money, China's money, because
exactly.
Can just default. So
it's the same. Exactly.
It's the same.
What you get. Well, I mean, this actually is interesting. This is why the Chinese central bank want to have a digital currency. So you think about it from the point of view of a crypto entrepreneur. Why do you like this stuff? Because it keeps government out of the way. It's a fixed supply. They can't inflate it away. All that sort of stuff, right? Which is really problematic because really inflation is not about the quantity of money for whatever reason, right? But anyway, that's your story. It's also true that if you're a kind of semi-authoritarian or hard authoritarian government, imagine if you could have a digital currency where you could check where every single unit of currency is in real time. I could tell what Finn's spending his money on. I know that he's spending it on a porn stash, so I'm going to make sure his social credit score goes down. And next time he tries to go to a soccer match or whatever he's into, suddenly the computer says no. I can do total surveillance of my population precisely because it's a crypto. So, this thing that is this libertarian fantasy is also a totalitarian nightmare.
There are some cryptos, though, that you can put into and they're completely untraceable. Like Monero, for example.
Bullshit. You think the NSA doesn't know what this is? The NSA blow up Russian hackers all the time. It's just that you don't hear about it. They can get right into your wallet and wipe it out, or they can take out the entire exchange. Don't think it's invulnerable for a second.
That's no different. Well, I don't know what it's like in America, but that's no different to the banks here. Like my bank, Commonwealth, it has full access to everything. So it could do the credit score as well. Like
but not credit. I'm talking about wiping out your savings, right? If you hold crypto and governments decide to go after those exchanges, they can basically bomb your exchanges and you'll never get them out. Now, if you did that to a commercial bank, there'd be an uproar. But given the fact that you're doing it to a bunch of secret accounts from people who don't want the money to be known in the first place, maybe a bit easier.
Yeah. That's a pretty good point, yeah. So it kind of stops them. Damn. Hadn't really thought about it. So we have to stay, well, we don't have to, but at the moment, the American dollar is the best choice because it's got checks and balances.
It's not the best choice. It's the only choice. That's pretty much it.
Could there be
also
another one?
Wise to this one. So when the Chinese bring in their digital renminbi, which they're going to do in the next couple of years, digital dollar will be here in 5 years, right? Mm-hmm. And then what are you going to do? I mean, at the end of the day, what's going to be more or less volatile? What's going to be more or less trustworthy? That's the question. If America disappears in a puff of hyperinflation, then yeah, sure, switch to a Chinese currency, but then don't be surprised if you just can't get your money out.
Yeah, bank runs and stuff. They're limiting it here in Australia.
Capital controls. We're done. Right? I mean, look at what Beijing's doing to its tech sector. Right? Basically, you want to list in New York? No, you can't list in New York. Why not? Because we don't want the data that you gather going out of the borders. So let's say that you invest in Didi or one of these or Tencent or whatever, right? And then the Chinese state basically puts some security things on them. What happens to the price of those investments? Don't know.
Yeah, there's no way to know. Shit. So is there? So what's the way to make the system better then, from the American standpoint? So if we've got to stick with the dollar because it's the best option, then how do we stop people being so pissed off in the system because of all the money going to the top?
Pay them more. If you go back to where we started, just fucking pay people more, right? There's a paper that the Rand Corporation did. This is not a liberal think tank, trust me. And they did this last year. And you can get it on the interweb. It's called Trends in Income 1975 to 2020 or something like that, right? Just do RAND Trends in Income, you get it, right? According to their calculations, if you had kept taxes and regulations and benefits pretty much the same as it was in 1980, right? Your average American worker would be, if I get this right from memory, $15,000 to $16,000 a year better off. I think people would be a lot less pissed off. And when you get up to the higher parts of the income distribution, they'd still be better off, but less so. The whole thing would be a more equal distribution. More equal countries just tend to be less pissed. It's an empirical fact. And before anybody goes, but what about Sweden? Because they've got fucking right-wingers and all that. Everybody is right-wingers. Being right-wing is not a brain disease, right? It's totally fine to be right-wing. It's totally fine to be skeptical about government intervention. Not everybody needs to love immigration as if it's the best thing in the world, right? People have different political preferences. But when they become weaponized, right? And what's driving that is the fact that you have extreme income and wealth inequality and you refuse to do anything about it. That's when it gets problematic.
Then you'd have to convince the people at the top to give their money up, and
right.
that's where you run into the issue.
Well, this is the classic, isn't it? Right. This is why we got World War I. This is why we got the Russian Revolution, because the people at the top just go, no. I mean, I may have everything, but I'm not giving it away. No, just no way. So if you look at the way the American billionaire class talk about this crap, right? So it's like, no, I don't want you to increase taxes on me, even though I use every loophole in the book, right? My favorite little outrage from a couple of weeks ago was discovering that, what's he doing? And Peter Thiel had $5 billion in what's called a Roth IRA. Now, a normal person can only put $16,000 a year in this. So how the hell did he get $5 billion in it? It's a little tax loophole. Brilliant. So what he did was he got a whole bunch of shares from PayPal and other companies like that he was involved with and priced them at 0.0000001% and basically made everything worth $5,000 or whatever it was, threw it into this thing, declared that as the same value, and then walked away. And miraculously, it's now worth $5 billion, right? And of course, when you retire, you take all that money out and you don't pay taxes. Right, so this is that these people pull all the time, day in, day out. Corporations do the same thing. You're paying 35%. I'm paying 35%. Ordinary stiffs are getting totally stiffed. They're running off with it. Now, can we just stop that? How about basic fairness? Capital income gets taxed the same as labor income. Oh no, then they go mental. Then what do? They refuse to reform. Then it's this thing about philanthropy, but I give away so much of my money. You know what the effective tax rate of American philanthropy is on the people who do it? 0.4%. It's bullshit. And most of the foundations that are set up to better society, the Gates Foundation, all the rest of it, they're all fucking tax losses. Right? They're set up because they basically act as tax shelters. So long as you give out a certain amount of shit, you can keep the principal and grow it. So, when people think the system's rigged, they're not wrong. They're really not wrong. It totally is.
Is it inevitable that it ends up that way, though? Because you've got the people who keep earning the most amount of money. They obviously want to keep that money. So is there any system?
But why are they earning that much money? If they're earning that much money because they're so brilliant, right? And that happens sometimes, right? We can talk about Apple in a minute as an example of this, right? Then that's totally fine. But if they're earning it because basically Apple as a company pays no taxes, then what the hell is that?
Yeah.
That's not how wonderful you are and how innovative you are. Look, see one of these things? Right, this thing, right? This thing basically has a bunch of small critical technologies in it. TCP/IP, invented by the Department of Defense. Yeah. Lodestar, the touchscreen, the U.S. Air Force. GPS, right? U.S. Navy for targeting, right? So this is all the technology was invented by the public sector. We then give that for free, and a smart bloke called Steve Jobs comes along and goes, if I put all this shit in a pretty box, I'll make lots of money off of it. And that's fine. But if then Mr. Jobs and his company goes along and says, and then we're going to shove it all through a tax haven called Ireland, and then we're going to put it as dividends through Holland, and then we're going to shove the whole lot in the Cayman Islands, so that at the end of the day, Mark Blyth pays more in taxes than our entire organization, then no, just no.
Yeah. The trouble I see with that, right, because obviously it all makes sense, get them to pay more tax. However, as far as I'm concerned, they own the politicians. So if
You're
they can
not
donate
wrong.
100, yeah,
You're
if they
not
donate to the
wrong.
politicians, then they're not going to rule against them. So
Yeah, so
how do we get out of it?
it's a hard problem. But is the solution to abolish democracy and embrace a dictatorship?
No.
Probably not. Right.
Yeah, no.
So I was like, you look what I was doing. I was like picking this is the cursor. Very good. Anyway, so yeah, so that's a real problem. Give an example of this. There's been this new G20 tax agreement, this global minimum tax of 15%. We're going to tax corporations. Woo-hoo. One of the guys who signed it, Sunak, the British finance minister, immediately went home and carved out an exemption for banks. What is it that London does? Banks, right? Yeah. Hypocrisy everywhere, right? 2 days ago, yesterday, the ECB, European Central Bank, did its new policy review. And without going into any of the details, one of the things they did was a big focus on green, right? We have to go green. We have to take the climate crisis seriously, whatever, right? Literally the next day comes out this thing on aviation fuel. We're not going to tax business jets. We're not going to tax the fuel in business jets. Right. So basically, I'm off to the Costa del Sol for a piss up for the weekend. I'm going to have to pay an extra 50 quid in fuel taxes. Meanwhile, Mr. Bezos Bozo flying around in his Learjet or whatever it is, he's getting tax free. Like, really? And you want people to believe you and take this shit seriously? I mean, come on.
Fuck. I mean,
it's always worse than you think.
Yeah, but I just don't know. Like, I don't know how we get out of it. Like, it just doesn't, because they're gonna stay at the top. Bezos is not going to give up his money, so he's going to stay there, and he's going to keep paying. Well, he's already got the data of all the politicians, which is already fucking scary. I don't know how he managed to fucking get that, but he literally owns all of the data of pretty much every politician, because the state computers now run on the Amazon servers, which I don't know how the shit he got that past, but anyway. He now essentially owns them, right?
Well, that is one of the ironies of the digital economy, right? I mean, basically, when we talk about this at the end of Agronomics, right, one of the things you can do is stop giving away your data for free, right? I mean, every time you use Facebook, you're giving them the thing that they use as the fuel for their profit engine. If we were doing mobile phone spectra, we would sell it to people or lease it to people, yet we just give our data away for free every time we're on a keyboard. All those photos on Facebook, grandma's looking at the grandkids, right? Taxed algorithms, the whole lot, boom, targeted adverts, blah, blah, blah. We enabled all that. But what people forget is we can disable all that. We can literally just go, no, you don't get to do that anymore. And there's a fair bit of that about to go down in the US in particular, and Facebook and Google are massively mobilizing against it. And like you say, their lobbying efforts are huge, and politicians are either corrupt or dependent on external financing, and they can come up with this. So yeah, there's a big obstacle. The one thing that gives me hope basically is climate change. And I know that's a weird angle, right? But I saw a bumper sticker 30 years ago that stayed with me, which is nature bats last, right? And I think that's absolutely true. And if you're in, Australia, well, I was in New Zealand when you were on fire quite 2 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, it was mental, right? We were getting out in the morning in Christchurch and wiping the ash off the cars.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the sky was like red from all the dust.
Exactly. Actually, in actual fact, a couple of days before, I was in Sydney, and Sydney was so awful, I went to Bondi, and we basically locked out and got this really good hotel in Bondi. And I've got the pictures, right? The sky's orange, but because the wind was blowing this way, you weren't getting the smoke, but you could smell it everywhere, right? Now, this shit's only going to get worse. And at that point in time, it doesn't really matter what Mr. Bezos wants, because you're dealing with like the basic breakdown of how societies function, right? We're beginning to push the limits on agriculture. We're beginning to push the limits on, consumption. And when you do that, nature bats last. And at that point, Mr. Politician, we don't really care anymore. You need to fix this shit. And they will, but only when, my classic example of this is when America loses Miami, when Miami is literally destroying the tidal wave, that's when they'll pay attention, not before.
It might be a bit of a different way of looking at it as well, but if... This sounds strange to even think about, but if we paid the politicians more so that they could get less corruption, would that be like a push in the right direction? Or
it certainly wouldn't work. I mean, this is why campaign finance reform, as they call it here in the US, is always such a big issue. So even at times when you get bipartisan support to do this, basically get the money out of politics by publicly funding elections and limiting the amount of money you can spend, then some bozo goes along to the Supreme Court, go into the courts, forces a series of challenges, gets to the Supreme Court, and then it's called Citizens United. And then you've got a bunch of Republican judges who go, corporations are people too. They should have their voices heard. Anyone can spend as much as they want. So you don't actually have to give it to the politicians. You just need to tell the politicians, if you don't do what I want, I'll spend $7 million a day telling your constituents you're an arse.
Mm.
How do you fight against that one?
I don't mean to be pessimistic here. I'm pretty optimistic most of the time, but I don't really see a way.
Why are you talking to a Scotsman if you want to be an optimist? That's a terrible thing.
Well, fuck. Like, where do we kind of? I don't understand what we do, because it sounds like the politicians are the ones that can fix this, and they
have all
corrupted.
incentive not to do it, right? Isn't that just brilliant? It's just lovely. Yeah. All right. So at the end of the book, one of the things that we try and do, I mean, these are all sort of like small scale, not mid-sized solutions, right? But the one you could do that's pretty easy to do, that would create a hell of a lot of cash without actually taxing anyone, is to take the model of a sovereign wealth fund and basically do it for everyone. So I'll give you the example for Australia, right? Every 10 years now, there's a major financial crisis. And at that point in time, your central bank steps in and basically stops asset prices falling, either by issuing guarantees or sometimes actually buying the assets and giving them cash and doing these fancy things called quantitative easing, which is essentially, I'll buy my bonds back and give you cash. The cash isn't earning you any money. Why don't you go buy some other shit? And then that goes up in value and it trickles down, and hopefully that makes people feel happier. It doesn't. It just makes houses more expensive. But anyway, putting that to one side. Why don't we do the following? Every time that share prices fall, the government, the fund, which is completely independent of the government, steps in with a big line of credit from the Treasury and buys them. And we just hold them. We don't buy them and give them back to the private sector. We just hold them for us, for all of us. Why don't we get the upside? Now, we know that every time that you stabilize these markets, there's a huge rally up, right? So the Dow, to take the example from 2008, the Dow went from 14,000 down to 6,500. It is now at 28,000. So imagine if you'd bought at 6,500, you'd issued 20% of GDP in bonds, you'd swapped those bonds for cash, you then got the cash and bought those shares, you would have stabilized the market and then benefited from the uprise in that, which runs at about 6% a year in real terms. Take out inflation at 2%, call that 4%. If you basically do this over a 15-year period, that would give you, if you did 20% of US GDP at 20 trillion, which is 4 trillion compounded at 5%, you get about $2.5 trillion bucks after about 10 years for doing nothing. How much is Biden's social infrastructure package? 2.3 trillion. I can pay for the whole lot. I could alternatively wipe out every student debt in the United States and have change left over. So there's lots of things you can do. You just have to have the imagination to want to do it.
Would that be reoccurring every 10 years?
Well, I mean, you could do your payouts in different ways. I mean, you're going to basically accumulate. You've got your stock of assets. They're going to grow at a compounded rate. And then you can decide when it gets to a certain size how you want to basically do it. The way that Eric and I talk about it in the book, which, by the way, is called Agronomics, plug the book. Eric and I talk about it in the book is, why is it that only rich people get inheritances? Why don't we just take everybody who's 21 years old when they get to 21 and we give them a proportional share of the profits of the fund? Every time somebody's turned 21, there's the check. Now, if you want to go on a massive bender and piss up with it, well, fine, that's a short-term boost to the hospitality industry. But we'd actually give you other tax advantages if you did it to go to school, get a master's degree. Actually, it's a shit idea. Start a business, whatever it is you want to do, right? Then you know, that gives you a better chance in life, and then you accumulate more assets, and then you pass that to your kids, etc. Kind of the way it's meant to be. Except we've just sequestered it all through like tax and regulatory changes to a tiny number of people at the top, and the bottom 80% are like, how the can I possibly buy a house in any major city in Australia?
Yeah. I feel
I mean,
like
just
the exact.
think about it. Think about how expensive housing's got, right? Basically, in
Yeah.
1980 around the world, we effectively stopped building new houses, right? And people say that's bullshit. There's new housing going up the time. Yes, but the old housing's falling down at the same time. It's just that you don't see that, right? So the net replacement just isn't there. Then you privatize finance, essentially. People have access to credit. The people who've got spare cash can start buying these things. You turn housing into an asset class. You lot in Australia weaponize this with, what do you call that again? Negative gearing on your taxes.
Yeah.
Which basically allows baby boomers to own multiple properties and get a tax credit for running them down while renting them to someone. It's like, why don't you become a slumlord? Everyone can, right? It's like, what kind of bullshit is this? And all of our politics are skewed towards basically giving old people who have got all the assets even more assets. Yeah. Right. Well, the young are like,
taken away from the
five of us got together, we can buy a flat, right? It's just like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
No society can survive. Forget the dollar. Don't worry about the fucking dollar. Worry about the fact that we're taxing the young to feed the old, and the old already have all the food.
Yeah. Yeah. It's. I don't know if it's borderline insanity or it actually is insanity, but it is insanity. It's something that can't.
No, I remember when somebody first told me about negative gearing about 20 years ago. I went, what?
Yeah.
You do no, that can't be right? You don't actually do that. They're like, oh yeah, we actually got. I'm like, what? Then I went to Australia and I met you. Where are you in Australia, Finn?
Queensland, Brisbane.
Oh, in Brisbane, right? Vegas, right? So I was down in Sydney and I went to, what's the place? Is it called Wimbledon? Do you have a Wimbledon in Sydney? It's like very, very nice house. Yeah. So I was walking around there, and these are nice houses, but this is like 15 years ago. And there was like, well, that's 3 million, that's 5 million. I'm like, what though? And it turns out everybody in this has basically been using this as a kind of home equity withdrawal machine to buy even more properties, to write it off against their taxes. And you're just like, what? This is just an absurd wealth concentrator. It's just absurd.
Yeah. It has to cause a GFC. There's no, or not a GFC, but it has to cause a housing crisis here. I don't see how it doesn't.
But this is the weird thing, right? I mean, I've heard this for 20 years and it never happens.
Yeah,
and it doesn't happen. Well, here's the weird thing about it, though, right? This is Australia's business model, and this is the whole deficits and surpluses, imports and exports again, right? How do you guys make a living? Because you stopped making cars. You basically stopped making fucking anything, right? Yeah. And what you do is you import capital from the rest of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And how are you able to do this? Well, you're able to do this because what you export is dirt, various forms of dirt, mainly to China, right? So China then gives you a bunch of those dollars that it's earned by selling TVs to Walmart, right? And you then go, well, what are we going to do with this? And you go, I don't know, let's buy an apartment in Sydney. And it gets re-intermediated into these housing contracts in these 4 cities on the other side of the country. And that's it. That's the business model. This is why when you try and tax the mining companies or anything, everyone loses their shit. I'm not surprisingly knowledgeable about Australia.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and then what happens is you start getting nasty to China because you don't like what they're doing, and the Chinese turn and go, "Oh well, then I guess we won't be buying your dirt anymore." It's like, oh shit.
Yeah, then there's a real fucking problem.
Yep.
Yeah. Fuck. So we need to buy the bonds so we can increase interest and then replug that back into the economy. My issue then would be the same thing that's happening now, whereas the elite concentrate it and they can buy the politicians so that in that 10 years time, all the politicians like, oh, what if we just give it back to the elite instead of giving it to everybody?
Well, there is such a thing as a revolution. So, you can't...
That's a last resort, though. That's a last resort.
Right? It's a last resort. No, but you can also set it up this way. The law that sets these things up is pretty straightforward. You can set it up essentially as a kind of like quasi-public private entity. You could have stakeholders from the unions, from the private sector, the public sector, whatever. You can put them on a board, give them a 5-year appointment, make sure that the renewal of the board is not in the hands of the treasury officials or the politicians. You can just write the contract in such a way that politicians are not allowed to go anywhere near this, nor are they actually. And for the disbursements, you could have a citizens' council. You could just randomly get 100 Aussies, stick them in a room and say, all right, come up in 30 days with how you want to spend money that we're going to earn in 10 years. How do you think we should do it? And you take out the 3 proposals from that and you stick it on a referendum and you ask people what they think and they go, oh, we'll go with that one. You don't need the politicians anywhere near it. They should be thought of as plumbers, right? What they do is move our shit around for us. They're not there to steal the shit.
Yeah, but it's what they're doing.
Not all the time. Not all the time.
Well,
but the incentives to not be good all the time are certainly present.
Yeah. That's definitely a politically correct way of saying it, I guess. Wow, that's okay. So there is kind of a way out of it. But then the question comes again, how do we actually implement that? Do you, like... Because we have to get the politicians to sign off in the first place?
How about your generation actually shuts up and goes out and votes?
It's mandatory here. We do. 98%.
Do you?
98%.
Do you? Yeah. Do you vote as much as old people?
Well, it's 98% of us vote, so...
Right,
I mean,
because it's compulsory in Australia, right? Now, with compulsory voting, right, that's amazing, right? That means that you don't have that demographic skew whereby you got it in like non-compulsory systems where the millennials vote less than the other rest. Congratulations. Why are you still voting for a bunch of climate change denying arseholes?
Yeah, that's a solid point.
So yeah, I mean, really, I got a friend called Lisa, right? And she gives me shit all the time about like, oh, America this, America that. I'm like, you had Howard. You voted for Howard how many times?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. He really was the poison, right? He was just awful. And like, you know, you got, oh, Morrison, you know, it's like the country's on fire. And he's like, well, not really sure what's going on. You seen that little gif of like the dog in the house and the flames are on? Yeah. You're just like, really? Right. Now, people are voting for this. So don't just blame the politicians. Blame the voters too.
Okay. So we need to change in the understanding. Okay. All right.
You need to want different stuff. You need to accept the fact that like we're not really in charge. We're this weird species that 5,000 years ago invented some technology that enabled us to subdue the planet. And now the planet said there's 7 billion of you fuckers and I've had enough. Right? So this is where we are, and we really need to get our heads around this problem, or there will be 1 billion of us probably in about 50 years' time.
Yeah, or less. Yeah, shit. Well, I don't.
And if you're not selling your dirt to China, you're gonna have to go back to doing something else.
Do you think China will start adopting the green stuff, like going green?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They have every incentive to. They also have the command and control mechanism to do it. So a lot of Belt and Road projects, their foreign investment projects, were and still are building coal-fired power stations all around Southeast Asia, which is just madness, right? And eventually Xi turns around and goes, nah, I think we should stop doing that. So that's that. No more coal. Like, okay, I guess that's it. We'll see what they do, but you know, the declaration is there. They also said that they want to go net zero by, I think it was 2050, maybe it was 2060, right? That's a huge commitment. But let's think about this one. In 2015, China installed more solar than the United States had.
Yeah, full stop.
I mean,
yeah.
it's just
in a year.
If they want to do it, like if they want to do it, they can do it. Now they've got every incentive to do it. The air sucks. You can't trust the water. You can't trust the food supply, right? So, you know, if that's the case, they've built all the bridges they need. They don't really need a lot of the stuff you're selling them anymore. I'd go long New Zealand because what they actually need is dairy that they can trust, right? And if you're going to do that, it's so much easier to clean up your supply chains. It's so much easier to basically clean up how you make pork. One of the interesting things they're up to now, believe it or not, is trying to rationalize and standardize the pork industry because they eat more pork than anything else. They eat more pork than anybody else in the world. It's incredibly polluting. The market totally volatile. You get swine flu goes through there, wipes are out, pork prices go up the whole lot. So guess what? The government's now like, I think we need to sort this shit out. So, you know, when they actually try and do things like that for all of the faults of the regime, they tend to have the mechanisms to do it.
There was something interesting I read. I think it was last year. Could have been the year before. But no, it was last year. I was looking at the financial planners in our government in Australia and each state, and I was looking at who they are and what their degrees are. And there was one that had a financial degree down in Tasmania, and that was it. And the rest of the country, I think 2 of them had arts degrees, and then the rest had nothing. It's like, so how do we get those guys out? We know that they don't have degrees in it, and they're still teaching it. Like how, I know you say just vote on it, but I mean,
No, but I'm not. I mean, you're talking about. Are you talking about the public servants, or are you talking about the politicians who want to run the finance portfolio?
The politicians, yeah.
Right. Well, they don't need a fucking degree. They're the people's representatives. I mean, it's the people behind them that advise them and tell them what you can do or what you can't. They're the ones you need to worry about. I mean, I don't think the Germans are very fond of this stuff, right? It's very beruflich, as they call it. Like, if you want to work in a bookstore, you need to do a 3-year apprenticeship. It's like, I'm working in a bookstore. Why do I need a 3-year apprenticeship, right? In the United States, if you want to cut hair, you need to do 1,200 hours of cosmetology school. It's like, really? I got most of it down in 20 minutes, right? This is nonsense. So, the problem with people who do finance degrees is they believe the financial models. And the financial models can be useful, but they're not true. And if you start to think the world behaves like your models, you're halfway to making the financial crisis happen. So, simply having a degree in something, yeah, I'm not sure that's qualification. Particularly for finance jobs in particular.
Have you contacted anyone in your, like, have you contacted Biden's administration or anything? Do they know about your plan? Do they?
Well, I don't know about them, but we've had conversations with people in the British government, lots of other people have talked to about it. And what happens is they'll go, that's amazing, that sounds great. Then they go talk to the people in the Treasury, and the people in the Treasury are like, so you want to basically generate a giant fund out with Treasury control that people can actually vote to spend on what they want? Yeah, no.
Why is it no, though?
That would drive them to madness.
That sounds pessimistic, though, because that sounds like nothing's going to change. I mean, what is there any way we could convince them that it would be in their interest to do so? Sorry, my dog's just getting under my leg.
I know, mine's falling asleep. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the way Eric talks about this in a good way. I mean, basically, what happens is there's a terrible thing about humans is nobody wants to be the first one to do something. Because if it doesn't work, everybody goes, right? So what's going to happen is, at some point, some government's just going to go, okay, let's try this. And it'll work. And when it works, it'll give everybody else permission to do it. But we're not going to do it until that happens. And it's the same with, like, big green transformative investment or whatever, right? And particularly if you're doing something that nobody's done before, everybody exaggerates the risk and plays down the upside. For very good reasons, right? Don't take big gambles, right? Well, that's fine so long as everything's going well. But if things really aren't going well, you kind of have to take that gamble every now and again.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm feeling pretty good after this.
Yeah,
thank you for coming on.
Right.
It's been a really good chat. Hopefully I can have you back on again and we can chat a bit more about it, because I feel like what needs to happen here is the politicians and the Treasury need to be the ones that change this, and for that to happen, the people. But
part of that is, I mean, stop voting for climate change denying assholes. That's put on a T-shirt, right? It's dead simple. Start there.
There is I don't mean to make you pessimistic here, but there's a dude in Canberra who believes in the flat Earth. That's how stupid our politicians.
Oh, we were. The country thinks the election was stolen, and the political party that we belong to does nothing to dispel that view. It's sort of like, really, that's real. If I were to describe America to you without telling you it was America, say, imagine the following, right? There's a country really politically divided internally. The rich have run off with all the money. Everybody else is like really strapped and stressed the whole time. Big corporations have way more rights than people and can do whatever the fuck they want, basically. The politicians are bought and paid for by and large. And there was an election. And basically the people who were in charge lost the election. And it was narrow margin, but external observers from all over the world said, no, it's pretty straightforward. And in fact, the people in the country, even in the other party, all said, no, honestly, it was fine. But this meme started that basically it was stolen. And they actually even said it before the result came out, almost like an insurance policy. Now they're doing bullshit audits and all this sort of stuff that don't really make any sense. 1/3 of the country doesn't believe that it's stolen. They're changing all the election laws locally to make sure that they are entrenched in power. This is really undermining democracy. You'd be like, wow, you're talking about Hungary? It's like, no, I'm talking about the USA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next time you think Australia is bad, you are run by climate change denying arseholes, but you can actually vote them out. It's not clear that we can in parts of the country.
Mm, mm. We like to think we can vote them out. I don't. We'll see. Once it happens, then I'll believe it.
Yeah, but part of the reason you don't want to vote it out, part of the reason you don't want to vote them out is because the Australian business model is really carbon intensive, and it's a rich country. It's a cool place to live. And if you ignore all the externalities that we're building up that eventually are going to bite us in the arse, like your country being on fire, right? It's a pretty nice place to be.
Yeah. Really nice. But then our main industry would just be tourism at that point, because if we're not exporting the dirt, then it'll just be tourism.
Right. You could be exploring different dirt. You could be exploring the dirt that you need to make for green tech.
Yeah. Silicon.
Yeah. Stuff.
We have some of the largest silicon mines in the whole planet. Yeah.
There's lots of different stuff. Exactly. It's all about how you think about the problem.
Yeah, it's very true. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Hope we talk again soon. And yeah. Alrighty.
Absolutely. All right. All the best. Ta-ra.
Thank you. Bye.